me again, and today we're going to talk a little bit about bike mechanics. So I know sometimes you don't want to mess with your bike mechanic, you don't want to worry about it, and maybe you're not super handy, but you want to determine when it's time to replace a few parts, and sometimes it can be a little tricky, but with some simple steps I'll be able to show you how to identify when your chain is worn out, time to replace your tire, maybe your hubs. That's a little harder, but your hubs are starting to get worn out, brakes. So let's take a look at a few things, and this bike is ready for a wash and clean, but just before I do that, I always check the chain, because the chain is one of the most neglected parts of your bike, and if you don't replace it, it can damage or wear out your cassette and your chain ring pretty quickly. So one thing you want to do is have a chain checker or a chain ruler where you can measure if your chain is too stretched, or actually the pins inside the links are starting to wear out and the links are starting to spread a little. And if you don't do that, it will start damaging your cassette. And I'm going to talk about the cassette in a little bit, but let's check this chain. This is a 12 speed. So you're going to use, there's two measurements, the 0.5 you use for 11 and 12 speed, and 0.75 you use for 9 speed and below. And pretty simple, you put the ruler, if it goes in the link, it means the chain is worn out and it's time to replace. And even if you force a little, it doesn't go in, that means the chain is still good. The cassette is a little harder to identify, but usually the cassette will, in my experience, you'll be able to use maybe 3-4 chains before you replace the cassette. So note when you replace the chains, and then probably when you're in your third or fourth chain, if you're starting to have some shifting problems or making noise, then it's time to replace, or just like every 3 chains replace it. If you're really good in keeping your chain clean and lubed, the cassette will last longer. If not, if you let your chain worn out too much, it will worn out the cassette pretty quick, and then probably on the second chain it will not work properly, so then you will have to replace the cassette. That's a little costly. The chain ring usually lasts for a long time, but you definitely don't want to worn out too quickly by not replacing your chain. Now the brakes. If you have hydraulic brakes, and a lot of people have them today, when you press on the shifter, on your brake levers actually, you'll see that it's going too far, and many people think, oh, I need to bleed my brakes. But actually, a lot of times, especially with the SRAM that comes with the organic brake pads, it wears out pretty quickly on the back. So you want to check your brake pads first to see if that's making your brake levers go too deep. So usually it's that. If you have the bike for less than a year and it's already, the brake levers are going all the way, most likely it could be the brake pads instead of bleeding it. Although I do recommend, if you replace the brake pads, to bleed, because you should do that at least once a year. So what you want to do is, your flashlight's not working. So what you want to do is get a flashlight that works, and you want to look, you don't have to remove the wheel from the bike. So with a good flashlight, you want to look inside the caliper, and depending on the model, you have to look in different ways. But you will be able to see and spot the brake pads and the resin or whatever compound you have there. And it should have a millimeter between there and the clip that holds the brake pad. If that's less and it's super thin, and you see that the rotor is running pretty close to the end of the brake pad, then it's time to replace it. And you should do that. It's not super expensive. Brake pads are not expensive. And if you don't, you can really mess up the caliper and the rotor. That are much more expensive parts to replace. Now I'm going to get another bike so we can check the hubs. That's a little harder to identify, but we can get some clues. So I got this bike, and this bike is, the hubs are starting to get worn out, and usually what you hear is when you pedal, you hear like whoa sound that echoes on the frame, especially if you have a carbon frame. A lot of people think it's the bottom bracket, and it can be the bottom bracket, but most of the time it's the free hub body that takes a lot of pressure and is subject to a lot of water. So it's usually the first, if you're talking about bearings, it's the first part to wear out. So I'm gonna try to record and see if the sound comes good in the camera, but it's not as silent. So as you pedal, you hear that bearings inside that are probably dry or rusted, and they start to make this hollow sound. Okay, I think the hub is harder to show on camera, but it's like a hollow sound. And another thing is always check your wheels and if the quick release is tight enough, and then you still you see some play on the wheel. Probably it's just an adjustment, but it could be that the bearings are starting to wear out. So you want to check that out. So since we are with the wheels, the tire is something really common that we need to always check. And a lot of people know that if the tire loses its roundness and it starts to flatten out, means that you already used a lot of the meat on the tire. But a lot of manufacturers have some markers, and Pirelli, Continental usually do this on their tires. It's a little hole, a little depression that is really easy to spot when it's new, and as it starts to wear out, it becomes very shallow. So that's a good marker to know when your tire is wearing out and it's time to replace. Also, it's not by usually wear and tear, but by time. The tire does get dry, the rubber dries out, and you start to see a few cracks on the tire. That's usually a sign that you need to replace your tire. So this is pretty much the basic, but since you stayed until the end of the video, this is a tip that I always share with cyclists that have bikes with cables, mechanical bikes. What you want to do is remove the hood cover of your shifter, especially on the right one, and you can shift to the lightest gear and you will be able to see the cable inside the shifter. And this is the point, this is where usually the cable starts to break. So with a flashlight, you can look inside and inspect the cable at that point and see if there's any little threads coming out. If that's happening, probably you're not shifting properly, you're having problems with your shifter, and you should replace the cables. So that already happened with me once. During a ride, the cable broke, and usually when you start to have shifting problems caused by cable is that point, because that's the contact point, and usually the right shifter where you shift most will start to fail. So every couple months, take a look inside there, see if the cable is still good. So that's it, some mechanical tips that will save you time, money, and will have your bike riding smoothly all the time. And I've been doing some more videos about mechanic and products. I haven't done much videos about riding, but I will do soon. It's just that it's been quite busy here at the shop, and there's not many cycling events during the summer, July, but going into September, October, we're gonna have a lot of cycling fondos around here in Florida, and hopefully I'll be able to join and show you some cool places to ride in Florida. So as always, thank you for watching, and I'll see you on our next ride experience. Ciao.